Well, good morning and welcome. And depending on where you are, it might be good afternoon or good evening. So we'll get started here in a minute. I was waiting for a few more people to join, but we'll get started. You're here. I'm going to put an invitation link in the chat, and that way you'll be able to, if you want to, you can come online on stage. So I can have up to 10 people on stage, and that way we can have some interaction, more so when we get into the Q&A part of it, and also when we start talking about doing some of the exercises. All right, so you had this, we've got this slide here. Let's go. We've got, trying to get, there we go. We've got this slide here, the 7 fitness areas. What I just want to talk about is that there's so much written about this topic, neuroplasticity, unconscious, high performance, and there's a lot of perspectives. As I talk to people about it, it's interesting to hear the different versions that people bring up, and it has to do with how they made sense of it. And I would argue that one of the reasons why there's this complexity around the topic is because of a few shifts that need to be made. We're going to cover those shifts, and without getting into it now. But so what this is not, it's not any mystical mumbo jumbo. I think it's different than anything you've seen before, at least in part. And it's not about you have to believe. You know, there are things that come out in law of attraction, and that was the late 1800s, things that came out in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. But keep in mind, neuro-linguistic programming was not a discipline in itself. It was a modeling. So they modeled the best of the best that they could find and then taught what those people were doing. It's like going to watch some of the best chefs in the world create this amazing cake, and you take the recipe and then you teach the recipe to other people. NLP was the modeling. Making the cake is the content of it. So it gets kind of confusing because people talk about it, oh, this is NLP. It's not NLP. It's what NLP learned about behavior change. But you could apply NLP modeling to anything that you want. All right, so this is about taking charge of the subconscious, because when you take charge of the subconscious, you're literally putting the automaticity of the subconscious to work for you. We've all experienced people being triggered, and that's that automaticity I'm talking about. So this is taking charge of that subconscious. I'm going to use the words unconscious and subconscious interchangeably, but I won't call it a subconscious mind, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So why the 7 fitness areas? It's a way to access what I call the superpowers without hours and hours of meditation. Nothing against meditation. Meditation is what I did to understand and to make my own journey. I used Emily Fletcher, stuff from Mindvalley, Joe Dispenza, Marissa, I forget her last name. There's so much information out there. Binaural beats. There's so much information about meditating. I first started meditating when I was 17 or 18 years old in the martial arts, and I hated it because at that time it was all about being perfect and quiet and all this, and it was more about the meditation. Emily Fletcher has a quote that says, "The point of meditation is not to get good at meditating. The point of meditation is to get good at life." And then that opened my eyes. Another thing that happened is someone recommended that I read a book. I was new in business. That was my phase 2 after leaving the corporate world and starting a business. And, there was stressful periods. And this book, 1 Minute Moment. And this book was all about how you can benefit from meditating in 1 minute. Now, people might say that's not really going to work. Well, when we get into this work, we'll talk about that. So without hours of meditation, and again, I like meditating, I recommend it, but sometimes people are so far off, or maybe you are so far off your norm that you don't even want to meditate. So how do you get back on track then? If you have to rely on meditating, that becomes a problem. Also, I didn't want to rely on the woo-woo gap. So I started this 4 years ago when I had to close my motorcycle tourism business because of the pandemic. I lost everything in that business, and so I had to start over. And I wanted something that I knew would stand the test of time, that I could still be talking about when I was 90 years old. So there were some factors I had. One of them was to not rely on the woo-woo gap. At that time, there was a lot of people talking about the universe, or it's manifested and the universe is going to give me that. And that really bugged me because they were giving up their agency. The third one is fear of getting emotionally hijacked or out of state. I followed Tony Robbins. I spent 14 days at a certification program in Maui back in the 90s. And I've done several. I've done his business mastery. So I've been with him for like weeks at a time. Date with Destiny was a week. And he talks about state, and it's very powerful. He spends a lot of time getting him state. In fact, I was in the group that did the longest firewalk. We did a 45-foot firewalk, and for whatever reason, he never did it that long again. And all of that. And I actually walked it a second time because I wanted to understand if this was really about state. So while I was walking on this 45-foot walk, I came out of state, and yes, my feet started burning. I had to go back into state very quickly. I almost ran off of them, but I went at it. I was like all in. So I went at it, giving the mantra, and then my feet stopped burning. So I was bought in. I said, okay, I got it. But the thing is, what happens when you get knocked out of state? You get hijacked so badly you can't get back in state, and the VUCA is going around you, or you're in a meeting and you're triggered. How do you get back in state? And then I wanted to also not have to rely on believing with more emotion. So you heard me talk about that. So Magic of Believing, that book was written in the 50s, I think. And, at that time it was all about, you have to believe, but reminding people to do the work, but you have to believe. And a lot of times you would hear people talk about how it's not working because you're not believing hard enough. So I didn't want that to be a factor. Now, all of those things are important. Yes, you've got to have the state. You've got to have belief. You have to, there is a small amount of woo-woo, and I call it our higher self. And I definitely believe there's a spiritual realm. But my point is, if I put things off into the spiritual realm, I'm giving up my agency for what I'm supposed to do. And let's say I choose to live by faith. I have to have agency to live by faith. That's not taking anything away from the spiritual realm. What I'm saying is that I'm living by faith, and I have the agency to do that. So those are the things, those were the stakes in the ground. And I came up with the 7 fitness areas. It's a framework I spent quite a bit of time on, going around, working on it. So there's a lot of stuff behind here because I had to get it right. Mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. Those are the things that are in our control. They call that the left side and the middle. And that's the be and the do. So this is a migration from have, do, be to be, do, have. And a lot of you as coaches are working with people, and you want to get them to shift to a be, do, have. You may not think about it that way, but if you've done any work along these lines, success factor stuff, you've come across, I'm sure, the be, do, have. And just think about it like this. Let's say that the right side, relationships, professional, and financial, was where we start. You can see that if somebody's going after a financial goal at any cost, the amount of things that can suffer, their relationships can suffer. I think this is where corruption comes into play. But when you put the relationships, professional and financial, those are the things that other people control. Maybe not fully, but relationships, there's somebody else. Professional, there's someone else. Even if I'm a solopreneur, there's still someone buying my products. Financial, even if I'm a trader, there's somebody on the other side of the trade. The things we want on that right side are somewhat controlled, at least in part, by someone else. So that's why we go the be, do, have, because the left side is what we control. And I call the emotional area the gateway to the right side, because if you don't manage that emotional area, or I should say modulate. If you don't modulate your emotions, you can easily get hijacked. But it can also be an empowerment catalyst, because you, by infusing your goals and your affirmations with emotion, you can do more. Now, I mentioned affirmations. That was another thing. I had to get something that didn't rely on all of those tools, and there's nothing wrong with those tools. And what's interesting, the reason why I went down that path is because of a certain set of circumstances. I actually became interested in this stuff at 5 years old. I had an experience that it just got locked into my conditioning, and then over the years, I had more experiences to reinforce it. But the point is, none of it worked all the time. There's always hit or miss. That's why I ended up in Maui with Tony Robbins. I was looking for this. What is it going to work all the time? That's why, the NLP, and then I went to the NeuroChange practitioner program, and I came up with the 7 Fitness Series because I wanted something that worked every time. Now, what does every time mean? It works often enough. Let's put it this way. Placebos can work as much as 50% or more of the time. And there are prescription drugs that don't quite work as well as placebos, but yet we accept them. So I figured anything above 50% or 60% is better than what we're getting with some prescription drugs. That was just a data point that I put out there. But I would say, if you go through the 7 Fitness Series and you focus on the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and you just do laps around here as you're working towards your vision and your goals, and you start with purpose. You have to have purpose. You have to have something big enough that's going to keep you in the game. But if you do laps around here, you will find yourself moving above the line, as I like to call it. Now, so there's 4 shifts that we're going to have to make in the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional to make this work. And I start with these 4 pillars: mental, physical, spiritual, as I said. And each area has automatic resistance factors, and they have empowerment catalysts. And I'm going to talk about those because they're very important. And that's a takeaway. So one of my objectives in this class or this webinar is for you to walk away with some self-coaching tools. So we'll actually get into some real exercises, and we can have some back and forth. And by the way, I put in the chat, I put the link that you'll be able to use to ask for invitation to be on the stage. And anyway, just click that link and it'll take you to a page where you can make that request when we get into the Q&A. So we'll talk about resistance factors, and you will walk away. I'll have you do some screenshots. You'll walk away with some things that you can start using today. That's the objective here. And repeatable, of course. And the other thing that's nice about the 7 Fitness Series is that when I'm working with the client, I know exactly where I am. I always know where I am. And sort of like in sales, in sales, I tell people you don't want to go into fact finding until you have enough rapport. And you don't want to do the presentation until you have a big enough need and want and desire and conviction. And then you go into the presentation. I would say don't even start the presentation if you haven't found that thing that you're willing to fight them tooth and nail for, because you know it's so important to them. When you have that kind of conviction, then you go into the presentation. So it's sort of like that. I always know where I am. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this emotional area if I'm struggling over here. We've got to get this fixed. And that's why I talk about doing laps, because as you do laps around it, you're going to get better and better and better. And eventually the emotional area, those blockages will go away. Or I should say be mitigated and modulated. All right. Now, the first shift we're going to make is conscious versus subconscious. Now, I mentioned I don't call it a subconscious mind. I talk with neuroscientists. They said, generally speaking, people talk about it as subconscious or conscious. It's universal. So I'm going with that. This is a huge shift because you have to be at your best, you have to discern the difference between conscious thought and unconscious impulse. Conscious thought, at its base, thought is energy. Now, there's another shift. It's not on the slide. But if you look at things through a Newtonian physics world, you're going to probably trip over some things here. I have chosen to step into the quantum physics world, and your people who've talked about this, who are on the cutting edge, they are all into the quantum physics, because as we're all atoms. So if you look at it any other way, you're going to have some disconnects. So Newtonian physics, or I'm sorry, quantum physics, because we're all atoms, and then you can look at what is thought. Thought is energy at its most base form. Thought is energy. And the thing that's going through our neurons, those impulses that are coming in, those impulses that we get, that's energy. And this is why it's easy to confuse the two as thought. They're not. They're different. And you'll learn to discern the difference. I have a short-term proxy for you to be able to figure out the difference. But eventually you will know instantly whether or not it came from your conscious thinking or from your subconscious. This is an important part of it. The physical area will rethink cognitive processing. And the point there is that a lot of our processing, cognitive processing, is actually physiological. And that's why I have it in the physical area. People tend to think that most of the cognitive processing is mental or in the mind. The majority is actually physiological. And so when I talk about 95% of everything we do is done by habit, that's what we're dealing with. It's a lot of that is in the physical area. Spiritual interaction with the higher self. I mentioned the woo-woo gap. And when I talk about this part, this narrow part of the spiritual, the physical realm. So I'm sorry, I got the spiritual and I got the physical, and this narrow part over here, I'll call that our higher self. Hold on a second. So this higher self is what we're talking about in the spiritual area. I'm not talking about the real spiritual realm. It's just our way of, if you will, interacting with that spiritual realm. And then emotional, this is maintaining growth mindset. So Carol Dweck's book is great, Fixed Mindset versus Growth Mindset. And it's not just about having a growth mindset, but being able to maintain it and get back to a growth mindset very quickly. You want to get to the point, especially as a coach, where you are back to a growth mindset instantaneously without even noticing that you. Now, the 7 fitness years, what I looked at when I was doing this, if you think about what we're normally doing, this is going along, this is 95% of the life I have it. I said, think of it like the Matrix, right? This is we all know you have, if you're a coach, consultant, practitioner, you know that you can spot these limiting beliefs. You can spot these habit patterns. Not only can you spot them in others, but you can spot them in yourself as well. And so this 95% by habit, people are just going along here. And what I was looking for when developing the 7 fitness series was to be able to make this inflection point. And this up here, if you talk about Joe Dispenza, he talks about field of infinite possibilities. I see that as this area up here. And this is the known. We know this is the 95%. We're doing it over and over. So when you break through that line and you're up here, it's different. And there's some factors up here like cognitive dissonance that makes it difficult. And we'll talk about how you get through that. Now, I talked about the conscious versus subconscious. The first way of looking at it, Daniel Kahneman, he wrote a book in 2012. I read it at the time, and I was looking at it more for financial trading, this fast and slow thinking. Actually, think the actual title of the book is Thinking Fast and Slow. I went back and listened to it again to see if he actually talked about what I'll be talking about today, and he did not quite get there. He got close, but he did talk about how the fast thinking is a big part of it is subconscious. That's your proxy. If it's coming almost instantaneously, like a tenth of a second, 2/10 of a second, you can pretty much bet that that's coming from your subconscious. So here, looking at the slide, the conscious mind processes only 50 bits per second, reaction time of about a half second on the conscious mind side. And that's if you're not distracted. If you're distracted, it can easily be 7 or 8/10. And then the subconscious processes at 11 million bits per second, reaction time of 250 milliseconds And so a little over 2/10 of a second. Athletes and people who do training to improve their reaction time, think fighters and things like that, they'll have a reaction time that gets down to something that's more like a dog is about 150 milliseconds. So that's pretty fast. To put it in perspective, we've all seen cats react to like snakes. I don't know if you've seen some of those videos, but cats have a reaction time of about 80 milliseconds, just to put that in perspective. Anyway, ours is about 250. And if your thoughts are coming in that 2/10 to 3/10 of a second range, is probably coming from the subconscious. And then the next step I want you to do is recognize that as fast thinking, and then say, what is the subconscious? The subconscious is about the past. It's associations, it's our conditioning. A lot of that conditioning happened from 0 to 7. And we live a different life than we did when we were 0 to 7. If you're 50 years old today, think about it. From 0 to 7, there was no computers in the homes. We didn't have fax machines. We didn't have instantaneous news. We got our news locally. And we just didn't hear about a lot of things going on. The globalization piece wasn't in play like it is today. And to think that the majority of our conditioning comes from age 0 to 7, it gets sort of reformed from 7 or 8 to about 19. And then from 19 to 27, the prefrontal cortex completes its forming. And roughly a fifth of our brain's neurons are in the prefrontal cortex. And I like to say that's sort of operationalizing our habits or our conditioning. So we're conditioned from 0 to 7 largely because we're in theta state from age 0 to 2, and then alpha state from 3 to 7. And then, so it's just a download. We don't have to work for it. We just learn. And it makes sense because in a hunter-gatherer environment, by the time we're 8 years old, we need to be participating in the hunting and the gathering. So it's like, how do you learn all that if you didn't even have a language for 25% of that time period? Well, this is how we learn to get along in the tribe. It makes sense. Even in the agricultural time for us, 0 to 7 was probably very much like, 50 years old. But let's look at it today. A 50-year-old today, their life is extremely different than a 0 to 7. Think about the alpha generation and Gen Z. So you're people who are under about 25 years old or so. Even for them, what they're growing up with artificial intelligence, the alpha anyway, but computers, the games were computerized. My point is, our model for the conditioning at 0 to 7 does not really work in an environment where Moore's law has been in effect since the 70s, where roughly technology capability doubles every 18 months. We're like in this steep part of that curve is changing very, very rapidly. So if you don't have a plan to be able to get through this, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. So here's what's normally happening with fast and slow thinking. This is the typical response cycle. There's a stimulus, and Atomic Habits, he talks about this as the cue, and then there's about that 250 millisecond reaction time, and then we react, and that reaction equals the response. So we call it a stimulus response cycle, and I would say that the reaction matches is what the response is. We actually give up the deciding in this scenario. We just act, we speak, we fight or flight, we freeze, we withdraw. I talk about trust is built on the escalator going up, but can be lost like on an elevator going down. I said that to a client once. They said, yeah, or like jumping out the window, because we've all seen where somebody has lost trust that fast. So we want to have, this is the first area that I'm going to break down. This is why it's important to understand this fast and slow thinking. And I would argue that behavior change is locked up by our current paradigm. And what I mean by that, if I line up 100 people and ask them if they could have a reset button, how much would they pay for that reset button, where they could reset their life to be something that they designed? People would spend probably half their life savings on that reset button. Yet, so they really want to change, which means they've tried, they've done some things, and it's not working. So this is something people desire, but there's things in the way. Now, what I have here is in the mental area, we got a pause of 1 second, and that makes a difference, right? Just 1 second pausing. So what we don't talk about enough in that stimulus response, we don't talk about this pre-stimulus, and this is all your priming, your cognitive biases, social influence. If you really want to get some interesting top content around cognitive biases and priming, John Bargh, B-A-R-G-H, he wrote a book, Before You Know It, and he gives some examples of priming. One of the ones that's the most bizarre for me, really pushed me into wanting to get more about this. He said that, they do double-blind studies to take out influences. He said if a person had a cup of warm liquid in their hand, if they're holding a warm cup, whether it didn't matter what it was, coffee, tea, whatever, as long as it was warm, their responses to people, and they use the same kind of situation, like somebody getting on an elevator and standing in their space, just different things like that. But they use the same ones through the experiment, and because it's peer reviewed, so other scientists were able to get the same results. They would have a more compassionate response when they had a warm cup in their hand than when they had a cold cup or glass in their hand, or when they had nothing in their hand. So if there's nothing, they had a level here of compassion. Warm cup, the level was here. Cold, the level was here. Now that is totally unrelated. What I'm holding on to is totally unrelated to this person who walked on the elevator and got in my space. Yet it's a factor in the result. So this priming impacts the stimulus. Another one real quick that I thought was very interesting. You've heard of these studies where they tell teachers that the blue-eyed kids are smarter than the brown-eyed kids or whatever. There's different ways of looking there's different studies that were done. And so these two scientists, or researchers, they say, you know what would happen? By the way, so one of the common research studies was that because in some societies, women are thought to not be as good at math as men. And so they said, interesting, let's do this. And they showed it, and they do these tests, and if the person has to answer their gender, then the women would do more poorly on the exams than the men. If they don't have to answer their gender, you get a more even distribution. So these researchers said, well, what would happen if we took Asian American women, because Asian American girls have this dual identity. The Asians are thought to be good at math, but women are thought to be poor at math in the US compared to male counterparts or non-Asian counterparts. So they said, let's do this study with Asian American girls. And they put the gender first and then the ethnicity. And then they did some examples with the ethnicity first and then the gender. And then they did some with just one and then some with just the other. And over and over and over, the studies showed that when they did ethnicity first, they did better on the exams. And when they did gender first or gender only, they did worse on the exams. That really tells you how important priming is. So if you're not paying attention to priming in yourself when you're getting thrown off, always go upstream and say, what happened before that? What happened before that? This thing can go on for days. Priming can. You can be primed days in advance if you're not careful. Then we have the stimulus itself, the 2.5 tenths of a second reaction time. And if you're more heightened, like tightly wound, I would say the reaction time is probably faster because you're already primed, and you're primed, unfortunately, for something bad. So our reaction is probably going to be bad. Then we have the reaction, and then we have the response. So this whole thing is happening, well, not the priming part, but this whole thing is happening in less than a half a second. If we just add a pause of a half second, you don't even need a full second, a half second, we then start to take control and take back some of our agency. I want to talk about the self-determination theory. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but this is an important one for you to look at. So it's based on 3 human needs. This was formalized around 2000, but the research was first presented in around 1967. So it's been around a while, and I will say it stands the test of time. It also aligns with the 6 human needs, which are significance and connection, variety, or certainty and variety, and then growth and contribution. And the short version on that is if you take growth and contribution and focus on those 2, the other needs get met. because you're not bouncing back and forth between variety and certainty or between significance and coherence. You focus on growth and contribution. But the self-determination theory aligns with that. Autonomy, it's agency and choice. So you actually have to be proactive, and being proactive keeps you in the autonomy. In the workplace, the job description dictates your autonomy, and you have to be proactive to exercise autonomy within those parameters that you're given. If you are a business owner, you have to make sure that you're creating the autonomy and that you're leveraging the autonomy. And then competence, feeling capable. I know a person who, when their competence goes down, they tank. And it's interesting because they could be flying along at the highest of the highs, moving along, great results, and a few things happen, a few trips happen, and you would think that, people call about jinxing, and what it turned out was their competence would drop. And once their feeling of competence would drop, then they would go into a fixed mindset, and then the spiral would begin. So the objective was to keep the competence up, and you can manufacture that. And what the solution was for this person, never stop cold calling. Because if you're in sales, cold calling solves all the problems. Prospecting solves all the problems. You need more clients, you need more revenue, you need more referrals. Cold calling, prospecting creates a pipeline of the kind of clients who are going to give you more revenue per sale and likely more referrals and stay longer. So what would happen is when things would go wrong, the competence would drop because the results would drop. The point was to keep dialing, and then you don't have that hit. And then relatedness, being seen and heard. And a part of this, you can determine what your rules are for being seen and heard. A lot of times, like if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the physiological needs, then the security needs, and then the love needs, you can use society's definition of what those rules are, or you can use your own, and you create your own rules. So you don't have to wait until somebody else tells you that you have enough love. In fact, expressing love releases oxytocin. So you can feel love just by expressing love. Certainly your physiological needs and your security needs. I use the example, if you're dropped on a deserted island, the first thing you'd want to do is take care of the physiological needs, and then the security, you food and shelter, and then you make sure you're safe. You got some weapons to fight off any animals, and then, you go on. But you no matter where you are, you always can start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and set the rules for when you've decided, because there's no reason. It doesn't take years. It could be a day. You can have all those needs met, even to esteem, could all be met in a day, and then you're working on self-actualization. Another story. So here's some tools. I'm going to start introducing some tools, and some of you may be familiar with these. Implementation intentions, if-then plan. So if this happens, then this is sort of like priming. What you're doing is you're priming your subconscious, because you remember the subconscious doesn't know the difference between real and imagined. So you're priming your subconscious to act a certain way or to do a certain thing based on a stimulus. So that's some if-then plans. And then you have mental contrasting. That's seeing the obstacles. One of the problems with the positive mental attitude, let's be positive about it, let's be positive, we can do it, is that we underestimate the difficulty. And then when we get hit with difficulty, we go into a fixed mindset, and the fixed mindset causes us to get off track. So by coming up with the obstacles and coming up with plans for the obstacles, and you can see how that can work hand in hand with implementation intentions. But now you have the obstacles, so you're recognizing it's difficult and you're slowing it down. As a business owner, you might notice this, where you come up with these plans and it just takes so long to build something. One of the things I like, the one thing, work on one thing in the morning, first 90 minutes to 2 hours, not to be confused with 1991 by Robin Sharma. I would say Robin Sharma's is more operational, and I would say the one thing is more for project. That's my opinion. But in that mental contrasting, you're making sure that you're uncovering all those potential obstacles. Otherwise, you just get thrown back and set back as you go through it. And then mental and physical. Here's a swish pattern. The objective of now, if you've done this was talked about a lot in NLP. Again, this is not NLP. It's one of the patterns that's taught in NLP. And just go ahead and take a screenshot of that. I use this often to help people get rid of their ums and uhs. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to take a picture, associated picture, looking through their eyes, as about to say so I'm about to say I'm speaking, and then so just before I do that, and then I'm going to blow that picture up and explode it, like shatter it, with a new picture of me having a standing ovation. And then I just do that 3 or 4 times, and you can do that right now. So you do it with biting your nails, you could do it with a twitch, you could do it with any idiosyncrasy that you have. Pick something that's light and easy, some idiosyncrasy where you want to get rid of it. You've been trying to, maybe you say like a lot, or maybe you say, whatever. As you're about to say it, looking through your eyes, it's associated. As that's coming, explode it instantly. You say whoosh, and you replace it with a dissociated picture. In other words, I'm standing here, I'm looking over there, looking at this picture of me getting a standing ovation. So I see the audience and I see me. Or if it's biting your nails, you see yourself with the manicured hand. Or if it's saying, you see yourself fluidly speaking and an audience is paying attention to you, whatever it is. And you do that 4 or 5 times. So you can do that right now. Just go through it a few times just to experience it and notice how it works. I do talk about the risks with respect to this swish pattern, because you don't want to swish away some self-control mechanisms. For example, you might have something that gets in your way. This is not to be taken lightly. This is for these easy habits. You can actually swish away a self-control item that's important for you. And then there's the steps. You can take a screenshot of that. I've done this with clients. I pick and choose. This is one of those things I can use, but again, if it's something that the person is challenged with, and I think it would be to get rid of, to get past it, then it makes a lot of sense. Now we're getting into the physical. So the physical, we have 100 billion neurons in the brain and the nervous system. You may hear 86 billion. 86 billion basically is the brain, 14 billion or so of the nervous system. I mentioned before that the prefrontal cortex, about a fifth of it, of our brain, or our brain's neurons, are in the prefrontal cortex. That's 20 billion neurons in the prefrontal cortex. So essentially, we didn't have those neurons. So that conditioning of the prefrontal cortex, that's why I say it's like operationalizing the conditioning up to age from 0 to 19. The prefrontal cortex takes everything we've learned and operationalizes it for our future life. Remember, the purpose of the subconscious, this inner program that we have, is to survive long enough to procreate. And so that makes sense from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. The 100 billion neurons, they interact with each other, firing and wiring, and thousands of other neurons. So literally you can have one neuron interacting with 10,000 other neurons. There's a lot of interconnectivity going on there. And this is where your impulses are coming from. And this is that fast thinking I'm talking about. That fast thinking is actually the subconscious, and it's coming from the neurons and the firing through the synapse, the neurotransmitter. And as I said before, that is an impulse that is very similar, and its energy is very similar to thought. And so it's easy to confuse that with thinking. This is a major shift. No one's talking about this, in my opinion, or I've asked a neuroscientist, why are we continuing to call it a subconscious mind when we know this? And they just roll their eyes in a way, it's like, man, who can take that on? It's like, we've been calling it a subconscious mind for 200 years, more than that, 400 years. How can you undo that? Psychology is the study of how we interact with our subconscious mind. It's like, how do you start unwinding that? But for you and I, we don't have to live into that paradigm that calls it a mind. We can look at it for what it is. And it's a physiological, it's neurobiological. Fast thinking is subconscious processing, and it's because energy is going so fast through the neurons, which is why we get those fast reactions. That's why sometimes it feels like it's out of control. But here's why it's such a big shift. This is what I want you to catch. When you're talking to a client and they say, I really want to do X, Y, and Z, but you find them resisting it and not doing the things that are necessary for the X, Y, and Z, instead of looking at both of those as choices, you want to look at what they say as I want. When they say I want, or I will, or here's what I want to do, whatever, anything that they're desiring, that is them. That is who they are. Whatever's holding them back, whatever's pushing them back, in my opinion, is the physical. It's the subconscious. It's the conditioning in the neurons. It's the network of neurons, that conditioning that's causing them to not do the thing that they're saying that they want to do. Slow thinking is the conscious mind working. And I should say here that people have been trying to define the mind and define consciousness, and they get tripped up. Defining the mind is very difficult. There's a line out there that says the mind is the brain at the mind is the brain at work. I think that's, yeah, the mind is the brain at work. But I would say no, because the mind and the brain are separate. The brain is physiological, is neurobiological, however you want to say it, and it's the 100 billion neurons. The mind is, if a person dies, their mind, their spirit, it's gone instantaneously. Their brain and nervous system are still here on Earth. Now, the energy that was going through those neurons may be gone, but they're here on the nervous system and brain are here. So those are physical. The mind is not. They're different. So the objective is to learn the difference and have them work together. So what we're doing is we're taking what's happened is 95% of everything we do is done by habit. So the 95% is here. We've allowed that to be above the conscious mind, but it's the subconscious. The subconscious should be below the conscious mind. And an example of this cognitive processing. So I mentioned that our prefrontal cortex is formed from about 19 to 27. Most people remember at 18, you have very little fear, very little risk aversion. We're willing to do anything. We didn't have a self-control mechanism. Self-control mechanism, the executive function, that's all in the prefrontal cortex. And as I said, the prefrontal cortex sort of operationalizes our conditioning. So let's say that there's something in our conditioning. I use the example of the parent at home. The door-to-door salesman comes, the parent gets annoyed. They, yell and scream about this door-to-door salesperson. The 5-year-old kid is there. They pick all that up. They decide selling is bad. That just gets locked in. No rationale, nothing. It just gets locked in. Fast forward to when they're 35 years old and they're trying to sell. And then what happens? They have this self-control mechanism that stops from selling. Or it's like resistance or self-sabotage. This is that I don't want power. And it's an example of why I separate the you or the they and then the behavior. So they are not their behavior. Their behavior is their personality. But when they say, I want to sell, I have to take that at face value and say that they want to sell. And if they're not doing the actions to be selling, then I have to look at what's causing that to break down. And when I look for what's causing it to break down, I'm not looking in the mind. I'm looking in the subconscious, and the subconscious is the neurons, which means conditioning. So there's some factors. And that's one of those is I don't want power. And I just bring that up because most people can relate to it, especially if you are big on using willpower, and then you run into this difficulty of using willpower as you get older. And the reason why willpower doesn't work so much is a couple of reasons. One, willpower wanes throughout the day, just naturally, sort of like a muscle, just gets wanes. It also wanes with use. So the more you use willpower, they've done a lot of studies. There's a great book, Willpower Instinct, by Kelly McDonegal, I think it is. Willpower Instinct is the book. great book, lots of studies in there, lots of information about cognitive biases, and you'll see how some of this comes together. But there's cousins of willpowers. I don't want power, and then I want power, and then there's I won't power, and those self-control mechanisms are meant for good, but they can end up being problems for us. And this is that self-sabotage that we hear about. Another one is reframing. So there's two types of reframes. This talked about a lot. You're probably familiar with it. Just quick review. Contextual reframe. You change the context for the behavior of the incident. Meaning reframe, you're changing the meaning of the behavior of the incident. So context reframe, leaving the meaning of the behavior or action the same, and finding context where the specific behavior has a positive value. Example, the child talks loudly and frequently in class. Original context, the child is seen as disruptive. Reframed context, the child's loudness and frequent talking might be beneficial in a situation where assertiveness and vocal participation is valued. So you get the point. And then the meaning reframe, you can take a screenshot of that if you want. And then the meaning reframe is the same thing. And at the bottom here, we talk about it as, this thing about a person is very meticulous to the point where it can be annoying, but that being meticulous might be great in accounting or quality controller. So it's finding the positive. I bring it up because these are tools that people are using, but when we think about where they're fitting, it's often after the fact, and we're already triggered. And if a person is triggered, doing some of these tools or some of these patterns is very difficult. And then the 6-step reframe, just the short version of it is you're literally talking to, it was taught as talking to parts, like with the part of me that's responsible for stopping me from selling, be willing to talk, be willing to communicate. And you wait for a yes. You're a little like talking to a kid. And then, but you're literally, in my opinion, you're literally having a conversation with your network of neurons. And it was never presented that way. But if you look at everything that goes on with this 6-step reframe, and you can go Google 6-step reframe, you'll find it. And then what you'll find is that there's always positive intent because the conditioning is there so that we survive long enough to procreate. So there's positive intent, and this positive intent may have made sense at 5 years old, but it doesn't make sense at 35. And that's where you're having the conversation. So then you say, okay, but here's the, I am working on selling, and the protection would have been, yes, I'm trying to keep you from being rejected. That's why this part of you keeping you from being rejected, because rejection hurts. And then you say, okay, but I need to have rejection in order to make sales because my service is not for everybody. And I have to have people decide that they don't appreciate it. So can you look at rejection instead of rejection about me? Can you look at it as they just don't appreciate the product? And then, and that way you can let me continue selling. Is that agreeable? Does that work for you? And then part says, yes, literally you can have this conversation with yourself when you talk about it with parts, and just be calm and recognize that oftentimes you're talking to conditioning that formed when you were 5 to 7. So it doesn't have the knowledge, and it's conditioning. It's literally associations, and associations are from the past. So you have to treat it that way. And if you're doing something above the line into the future, the past is not going to be your friend in a lot of cases. And this is why fast thinking is, in my opinion, not always your friend, because it's coming from that past associations. And then the movie theater technique. I've used this movie theater technique. This initially was taught for phobias, and I've used it many times for phobias. You can get a phobia cure literally in under 10 minutes using the movie theater technique. But you can also use it if you've ever gone into a loop where you're asking yourself, why do I believe this? Why do I do this all the time? If that why, your unconscious or subconscious is always going to come up with an answer for that why. As a coach, you probably know, don't start a question with why, because it takes you into a loop. By understanding, by looking at that thing that you're wondering about, what you can do is instead of asking why, you do the movie theater technique. And the movie theater technique is this: you imagine yourself sitting in the middle of a movie theater, watching a screen. Screen is blank. You come out of yourself and go over to the projection booth. Now you're in the projection booth and you use these words with yourself. I'm watching myself watch the screen. And now on the screen comes me growing up from 1 year old, and I'm growing up on the screen from 1 year old, going through my life in very rapid fashion. And I'm watching myself watch myself, and I'm looking for that point in my life in the movie screen, as I see the movie screen, when this belief first happened. And then by looking at when that belief first happened, you can say, that's where it is. That's where it came from. And then you can ask yourself, does this belief still make sense? So I'm going to go to a, let's go here and here. So make this a little brighter. The brightness always. The brightness always reverts back. So if you have this beliefs and you go back to this time when you first recognized the first incidence of that belief, you're in the movie theater watching yourself watch yourself on the screen, and you come up with that first time that you hit that belief. And then you say, where did I get that belief? How did that come about? Think of this belief being a table. And, in tables, these start stacking things. So other beliefs are put on there: political preferences, religious preferences, kind of car you drive. Some of those things could have come from these beliefs. And so it's very difficult to change the belief. When you start talking about changing a belief, there's a lot of resistance around changing the belief for those reasons. But what you can do is you look at the table legs as the references and say, what's the reference? What was the situation that I got this belief? And then what you want to do is ask yourself, is that reference still valid? Now, this happens once you get used to it, it's seconds, literally. And you can uncover some really deep-seated beliefs using this movie theater technique. And you can do it with clients as well. When they get stuck and it's in a loop, and you keep going back to it, and you say, you know what, I've heard you talk about this particular thing quite a bit. What are some of the, let's look at that and see where you first came up with it. They won't remember. Oh, they'll come up with an answer. And then you go into the movie theater technique. So that's a nice way of getting behind that. Let's go. And again, you can probably Google movie theater technique. It's been out for years. And again, these are things that were learned from watching and modeling some of the best psychologists, therapists, and people like that. Now we have physical cognitive processing. I mean, still in the physical area, and I'm talking about cognitive processing. I talked about the pause. Because we're in the physical area, if you start with thinking about it as the five senses. Now, you've heard this research where they've had people practicing basketball free throws in their mind, and you had another group practice free throws in real life, and you had another group not practice free throws at all. And the group that practiced free throws in their mind were improved almost as much as the people who practiced free throws in real life. And the ones who didn't do anything at all, their free throws didn't change. There's so many studies around that. Race car drivers use it, athletes use it, this visualization. They've even shown, these studies have gone further and further, and they've shown where they use pianists practicing a piece in their mind, and the musculature actually changes. The muscularity of the fingers actually changes just from practicing. Why? Because if you practice with a lot of emotion, you're actually firing off the neurons. Remember, the neurons are physical. When people talk about muscle memory, I like to say it's actually nervous system memory. So as I'm practicing this piece on the piano, also firing those neurons. And while I'm creating muscle memory, I'm creating nervous system memory. And if you look up myelin, MYELIN, Dan Coyle in the Talent Code talks about it, as does Angela Grit in her book, Angela Duckworth in her book Grit. Angela Duckworth wrote the book Grit. She talks about deep practice, and deep practice is practicing on the edge of ability. And by practicing on the edge of ability, it's a real intent. So if you think about conditioning, conditioning comes from duration, repetition, or intensity, or some combination. By being on the edge of ability, you're adding intensity. That does more than just repetition. And you can manufacture that intensity. But as you practice on the edge of ability, the neurons are firing harder and faster and with more focus, and they get wrapped with myelin. The more you use a particular neural pathway, the more it gets wrapped with myelin. And as it gets wrapped with myelin, it fires faster with more strength and more accuracy. And this is why habits are hard to break, because that neural pathway is like an I-beam in a building. And imagine trying to cut that I-beam. It's going to take you forever. But if you go to the end and undo the bolts, you can take that I-beam off. I use that example because the neuron itself is hard to change because it's wrapped with myelin and it's locked in that habit. But the synapse, the neurotransmitter, the synapse in between the neurons where it's connected with other neurons, excuse me, that actually self-eliminates when you stop using the habit. This is why replacing habits is so much easier than adding a new habit, because you're replacing the synapse between the neurons. So think of it as senses. That's the physical. And it makes sense because conditioning is physiological neurons. And so if you're seeing in your mind's eye that picture, it's tapping in through the senses of seeing. The same with speaking. This is why, by the way, in sales, if you are a sales trainer, sales manager, if you know these, or you work with salespeople, get them, they got to practice out loud. They have to speak the words. If you're practicing a presentation, you'll do much better if you practice it speaking out loud than if you practice it in your mind. In your mind, the subconscious, the neurons are not picking it up unless you put a lot of intensity into it. Back to deep practice. But by speaking, you're literally firing those neurons, and now you're building some memory. Implementation intentions. I worked with a group and they would talk about, you take objects and you put these objects on the table, and as you speak about what you're doing, let's say it was a leadership program, and when you're saying, yes, I would then go talk to, and they would make you pick up yourself and go over to this group and talk to this group. And then after you do that, then you would have to, then I'd say, then I'd go back to my computer and type up the notes. They'd make you move back to the computer. Now, this was in the 90s, and they didn't know what we're talking about now. And the reason we know this now is because we can look where the brain is lighting up, areas of the brain lighting up, and that's how we understand this. But they knew what works. See, they were able to model what worked. And by having my sense of touch, this kinesthetic piece involved, it made it easier to remember. Now we get the spiritual. So we went mental, physical, spiritual. I'm still on the areas that we control. This is the third of the first 4, 7 fitness areas. And I said, this is awareness by your highest self. Consciousness is even harder to define than mind. But the way for our purposes, the way you can get there's awareness of awareness. You're aware right now that you're hearing my voice. And you are also aware that you're aware of that you're hearing my voice. And you're aware that we're having a conversation about awareness. You say, and you just keep going on and on and on. So this awareness, this to me is the higher self. This is the awareness of awareness, is like the higher self. It's where we can get that heart-mind coherence. This is that higher self, and we're going to use that higher self to help us program the subconscious. So remember, we started out, the subconscious was here. It's running the show. 95% of the time, everything we do is done by habit. And because we've looked at the subconscious as a mind, we've given it that kind of credibility. So when the subconscious has a reaction, which then becomes a response, we think that's from us. We think that's our mind. And I'm telling you, it's not from us. It's from our past associations. And it should not get the credibility of your mind. So we take the subconscious and we put it below the conscious mind where it belongs. Now you got the conscious mind here, and the subconscious is below it, which is why it's called sub. And then you have the higher self up here. And we're going to use the higher self to interact with the conscious mind to reprogram and reset the subconscious. And that's the reset button I'm talking about. So awareness of awareness, and this is how you take charge of that present moment. Joe Dispenza talks about the powerful present moment. He calls it the precious moment, the precious precious moment, whatever you want to call it. I call it the powerful present moment. But that moment is your entry point to changing your life. And if we're awake about 65,000 seconds a day, and we have multiple moments in a second, imagine how many opportunities you have to change your life. And if you're just living your life 95% by habit, then obviously you're going to have you're leaving possibilities on the table. So the spiritual area collapse the woo-woo gap through understanding. And that's a little bit beyond here now, but I do have presentations where I've done collapsing the woo-woo gap, but you get the point. I'm explaining everything from a neuron standpoint. I can even go further and talk about mirror neurons, which is how you and I feel empathy when we're interacting. And they show that the mirror neurons light up if I raise my arm, and even though you don't raise your arm, the mirror neurons that light up in your brain are the same that light up in my brain. So in other words, your brain is having a response to me moving my arm. That's where the rapport comes in. That's why getting into that same position helps with the rapport. It's the mirror neurons. These were first discovered around 1980. I think they were formalized in 1992, but I actually talked to the neuroscientist who knows well the guy who came up with the mirror neurons. And, there's not much talked about. If you think about the brain being 1 million years old, and mirror neurons have only been around for 40 years or so, you can see that it's still in the infancy. We just don't know much about it. Besides, if we have 100 billion neurons, how do you study those things? They're got to be really small. Honor the powerful present moment. Just talked about that. Mindfulness, consciousness, thought, mind. So that's the thought. You in that present moment, that one little moment, that moment meditation, whatever it is, you want consciousness to be pure, which is always pure. You want thought to be pure, no fears or anxiety about the future, no regrets of the past, just pure thought. And then your mind, you want your mind to be clear. So clear mind, clear thought, clear consciousness. And that's that powerful present moment. And that's where you can create and start entering into that infinite field of possibilities. Use your higher self to retrain your subconscious and put the automaticity of the subconscious to work for you. And now we're getting into training that subconscious. This one is a huge step. You can get progress. You can see progress in your life within a day or two, but I recommend doing the 6 weeks practice with this one. But within a day or two, you'll start to see benefits. It'll really lock in after about 3 or 4 weeks. And then by 6 weeks, you'll be a different person. So this is how we typically process. We're going to, the subconscious scans for risks and negative. It made sense. As a hunter-gatherer, you get into a new field, you see a new situation, it's going to scan for what's dangerous about this. How do I survive? In business, if you get a piece of mail from the regulatory agency, the subconscious will very easily make that a negative. It's like, okay, this is bad. Before you even open it, before you even know what it's about, it could just be some benign notice, but we immediately can slip into fight or flight. A very small percentage of what people worry about ever comes to pass. So there's a lot of time spent in stress response unnecessarily. So by scanning for the positive 70-30 instead of negative 70-30, the risks will still get through. So you'll still get those danger things. You'll still see the snakes and the spiders or whatever it is that you don't like, but you're not going to see everything as a Serengeti tiger. And that's the problem. The subconscious, it's very easy for it to interpret threats as the tiger on the Serengeti. And then we have a fight or flight. We have the cortisol going through, and it's all at that fight or flight tiger level, not what is normal. So this is where we are. We're going to do a conditioning reset right now. We're going to do it real time. I was just checking the comments there. All right, we have a neutral event. Let's call it just a neutral event. The subconscious imagines the worst case scenario. We've all experienced this before. That worst case scenario then goes into our reaction. And remember, this all happens in a quarter of a second. Now, if we're already stressed and highly strung, that could be even a little faster. We're triggered. We're primed to being triggered. So this neutral event comes in as a negative, and then it creates this fight, flight, freeze, or withdraw, or fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And once that happens, we're now triggered. And if you've ever seen somebody who's triggered, it's very difficult to get them off that ledge. And you become the enemy. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult curing phobias if you don't use that movie theater technique, because if a person's afraid of snakes and this other person is trying to get them to be okay with snakes, they become the enemy too. And now they're like, no, you're bad and snakes are bad. And it just goes off the deep end. So we don't want that. This is not good for us. Another way to think about this, life is fractal because everything is atoms. So if you look at your cells, if you look at your biological cells, when they're in protection mode, they go into a certain mode, and in that mode, they cannot go after nutrients. And we're the same way. When we're in that protection mode, so imagine somebody drowning. They need air, and trying to give them food or money. They're not interested in any of that. They just want air. So when they're in protection mode, everything else is closed off. And that's what happens when we're in fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And that's why we don't want to be in that state. We don't want all that cortisol going through our bodies all the time. And that's why we're going to do this conditioning reset. By the way, these are resistance factors. You probably can't see that. Well, you may be able to, depending on what screen you're on, but go ahead and take a screenshot. These are resistance factors that you can use with your clients. I talk about this quite a bit because as you're going through the 7 Fitness series as a coach, I want to be able to spot those resistance factors. The resistance factor is anything. It could be priming. It could be being tired, nutrient deficient, all sorts of things, shallow breathing. I want to be able to identify those. And then in this slide and on the next slide, you take a screenshot, that second slide, that second column, those are the empowerment catalysts that go with the first column. So the point is being able to spot those situations and then doing something on purpose to reverse it is the objective. But again, we're working on it in the past. And so this reset that I'm going to do is so that we don't ever get here. But you do have this, and it's a way to everybody's not going to be able to start off with the positivity reset. You may have to start here. And then this third slide is your universal empowerment catalyst. So these are things like, box breathing, for example, 4 breaths in, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds exhale, and 4 seconds hold that exhale, and then repeat, and you do that. So now you're doing about 4 breath cycles per minute, which is going to slow you down. It's going to slow everything down and get you calm, get you back to mindfulness. It doesn't always work, right? Sometimes you're triggered so far, but if you keep doing it and then cycling through, and other things that you could do is go outside and look up, just look around and change your frame that way. Again, that's the past. We don't want to spend time, but you have that. There will be times you could use it, and you can even use them on yourself, these empowerment catalysts. So now we have this, before the conditioning reset, we have this neutral event, stimulus, and then reaction. After the positivity, we're going to have a negative event, and then the subconscious finds and recognizes the benefit. And then we have the reaction. So here's the positivity condition. I'd like you to participate with this one, and then we'll open it up to comments. So you got the negative, you come up with a negative memory. So right now, come up with some negative memory, keep it simple. You lost some money, not anything bad. I don't want you to, nothing serious, but maybe you lost a few dollars, or let's see, maybe you had a slight fender bender, or maybe you ran out of gas, something slight, something that's not a major deal. Just come up with that negative memory. The next step is come up with the larger context. So let's say we're using the point that you lost $10. Yeah, it's annoying. It doesn't end your life. It's just an annoyance, and you're more annoyed with yourself for being careless. The larger context is that you had enough money to lose $10, or that you have an income to where you had money that you could lose the $10. That's the positive, that's the larger positive context. And now that negative memory sits in there. The point about this larger context is you cannot have the negative experience without the larger context. If you didn't have money to begin with, you wouldn't have been able to lose money. So this is about shifting the attention from the lost money to the fact of gratitude that you had money, and having money means sometimes you're going to lose money. If you're trading, sometimes you're going to have a bad trade, and you can't get caught up on the bad trade. The larger context is you have the ability to trade. Then what we're going to do is let that negative memory fade into the context, sort of like fading into that positive context. So the positive context becomes the bigger thing. I use this happened recently, and because I conditioned it, it happened automatically. I literally left my phone. Was it my phone or? Yeah, I left my phone in the car. I was going on a ski trip for a week with my adult kids, and we'd have to be coordinating where we are. I needed my phone on this trip. I actually needed my phone, and I was already through security, and I had enough time, fortunately, to go back to the car to get my phone and come back. But that's a long trek, right? You got to stay on the security line again. And, I don't know if depending on how you are, do you go through security right away, or do you wait, or whatever, right? Anyway, I'm glad I went through right away, so I had time. But when I said, man, I left my phone in the car, immediately I flashed on to, I sure am fortunate to be going skiing with my kids. See, if I wasn't going skiing with my kids, I wouldn't have been able to leave my phone in the car, because I wouldn't have been on the trip. You see, that's the larger context. And I'm spending time here. I'll tell you why in a moment. Let me back up. Let's see. We got, yeah. So then the next thing is, and then after you've so you can see it's barely still there, right? So you've let it fade into the background of the larger context, and then you have a mindfulness moment. Just get mindful and sort of like basking in the gratitude of that more positive thing. So I'm spending some time on this because it's easy to get tripped up, and I'll talk about it. This is not about having a positive mental attitude. This is not about reframing. I talked about those already. This is different. You are literally conditioning your subconscious. We are literally working on the neurons to reset the 0 to 7 conditioning to scan for the positive instead of the negative. Remember, the purpose of the subconscious is to keep you alive long enough to procreate. So it's looking for risks. What we're doing is making sure that we're scanning for positive instead of negative, so those neutral events don't become negatives. The really bad negative things, they'll still get through and you'll be able to react, but you're going to be in a much better state. One, because you didn't spend all that time in a stress response, and now you have more resourcefulness. And that's the point. If you are like that cell that's in protection mode, you don't have resourcefulness. You're not able to come up with great ideas. You're not able to act with your best capabilities. You have to get back to a growth mindset to be able to do that. It's not always easy to do. So we're going to go through a review. And again, I'd like you to do this with me. You have an unpleasant experience. In this case, I'm using a flat tire. That's your negative experience. The larger context is the car. Gee, I got a flat. Wow, man, I got a flat. But I have a car. I'm so grateful I have a car. So you don't spend any time there. And the way I'm doing this is the exercise you're literally going to do with yourself every day, 3 times a day for 6 weeks. You're going to sit, get mindful, do some box breathing. It takes you less than 2 or 3 minutes. You're going to think of 3 different instances that were kind of negative, and instantly, as soon as you come up with it, instantly go to the positive, the greater context. You're training yourself, you're training your subconscious to instantly go to the greater positive context. The same way I use the example, as I thought about leaving my phone in the car, before I could even get annoyed about it, the positive context was I was on a trip. So that's an example of how it actually works. I didn't know I was going to lose my phone. I didn't practice that thing. What I've done is I've trained my subconscious to immediately look for the larger context. After it finds the larger context, so the having a car is the greater context, the flat tire is the negative experience. Then what you're doing in these 3 times a day, 3 times per time, 3 times per practice session, 3 times a day. So I did it with meals when I first did it. I did it around meals that way. And I would just sit there. Maybe while the food was heating up or whatever, I would do my 1, 2, 3 and come up with 3 experiences. And you get really good at it. And it's going to, you're going to find a lot of negative experience. All you have to do is keep going back in your life. And it's going to start with small ones and then move up to bigger ones, but start small. So now we have step 1, think of a bad experience. Step 2, quickly switch to the larger positive context. Step 3, let the bad experience, see the tires fading into the car there. Let it fade into the presence of the larger positive. Resist the temptation to intellectualize, or because this is physiological conditioning. If you think it and okay, I'm thinking it. No, you got to do it. Just do the boom, 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 like the swish pattern. You're swishing. You don't have to say swish, but you're literally swishing in your subconscious to, when this is happening, boom, do this. This is happening, do this. It's the same way implementation intentions work. You're conditioning your subconscious. When this starts happening, do this. When this starts happening, do this. And then you bask in that new. And what you're doing is you're building myelin, because it's deep practice. You're building myelin around those neurons, and those neurons are now going to be reliably triggering to that new behavior. This is why I call it a reset. This is part of that reset button. Now, I spent some time talking about it. It's a positivity recap. It's a specific form of gratitude. It's not just gratitude. Because what happens when I explain this to people, they're fast thinking, right? The subconscious is trying to make sense of the thing. So it's coming up with this. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's this. Just slow down. Just slow down that fast thinking. Consciously, maybe take some notes. It's specific. It's a specific form of gratitude. You're grateful for the greater good that enabled the bad experience to exist. Yes, it's gratitude, but it's very specific gratitude that's connected to that bad experience. This is then the practice. I thought about my flat tire, but the greater positive is I have a car. I thought about that trade I screwed up and lost money on because of a stupid mistake. But I'm fortunate to have the knowledge to trade. Because if I wasn't trading, I couldn't have made that bad trade. It's not reframing. Framing is finding the good in a bad situation, which is subtle, may seem different, but like in that example of trading, the reframing might have been, yes, but that's just one bad trade out of 4. That's reframing it, thinking about the 3 good ones. That's different. This is about the greater context. It's not PMA. Positive mental attitude is focusing on the positive instead of the negative. Again, like the trading example, I had a bad trade, but I'm thinking about the good trades I made. That's PMA. This is not that. This is about being grateful that I'm engaged in the greater context. And the greater context is something that I've had goals about and I've worked on and I worked hard to get here. And this is just what comes with it. It's like owning a car. You don't complain about putting gas in your car, at least not a big complaint, right? You don't complain about having to drive. It's what you've wanted to do. You've wanted to have a car. Now you have a car. You pay for insurance. You put gas in it. You've accepted this. It's just normal. Positivity conditioning is retraining your brain to scan for the positive, because you're teaching it that everything that happens is in part because you have these great things in your life that you worked hard to achieve. And the conditioning drill. This is 3 times a day. For example, with meals, come up with 2 to 3 negative experiences from the past and immediately find the greater positive context. Spend only a few seconds on the negative experience and fully immerse into the positive, pleasurable, greater context, appreciating how fortunate you are to have blank. Do this at least 5 days a week for 6 days, increasing the intensity of the negative experience that you use. Start easy and build up focusing on a faster switchover. Immediately begin looking for the opportunities to apply the skill real time as you go about your day. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take a break here. We'll take 5 minutes. I've got 21 after the hour. 20 after the hour, we'll come back. Let's make it 7 minutes. We'll come back 27 after the hour. And I'm going to put this invitation into the chat. And then you can use that link to ask to be invited onto the stage, and then we could have a live voice interaction. Because what I want to do when we come back from the break, I want to get your sense of how this is landing. I want to get a sense of how this is landing for you. I want to know what you think in the positivity exercise. We need to talk about the shift. So there's 3 shifts so far. Slow and fast thinking. It's seeing the subconscious as a network of neurons and not a mind. And now we have the positivity that we're doing it with I'm covering it in the spiritual area. After that, when we come back, we'll get into the emotional work that we're going to do, the emotional modulation, and that's where we're going to reverse triggering after it happens. So I'll come back at 27 after. Let's make it 28 after the hour because I've been talking. So 28 after the hour, and we'll talk about the shifts. All right, welcome back. I see I don't have anyone coming up on stage. Use that link though. If you do, then you have to answer some questions. You don't, it's just quick about your microphone and your camera. And that way we can have a talk, or just use the posting a comment. So before I go on, I just want to get some feedback as to how this is landing for you. Thoughts, how much of it is new? How much of it have you already made the decision to think this way? How much of it do you already use? Just anything. And we're specifically talking about the fast and slow thinking, and that the fast thinking is the subconscious. We want to talk about the physical, that the subconscious is actually not a mind at all, but rather a network of neurons. And then the spiritual being the higher self, and that we can use that higher self to start reprogramming the subconscious. And I use the positivity drill as an exercise or as a way to do that. So any comments there? And I'm going to start moving on. So now where we're going next is to talk about, we wrapped up, back up here. Where I left off was with the conditioning drill. And we talked about the step one is think of a negative experience. And you're going to have, so if you do this 3 times a day, that's 9 experiences a day times every day. So now you got 72 a week, and you're going to do this for 6 weeks. You're going to have over 500 experiences that you've done this. You will have conditioned. And the other thing that's going to happen is you will have taken a lot of those negative experiences that sort of like, make you do that. And they're just gone, all of them. But it's not about fixing those. It's about conditioning yourself for the future. Now, let's move on to the next area. By the way, this is the new response cycle. So you have stimulus, and before you react, you have this positivity scan. So it's a positive scan that replaces the negative scan, and that's what's going on here. Then you have the reaction. So you're going to have fewer negative reactions, and then you'll have the assess part. And this is, by the way, about a half second. And that's why I say if you can just pause for a half second and let the subconscious catch up. But by doing this positivity, it makes this less of a factor. But if you go back to where we started, mental, physical, spiritual, I may have had to do some of this more with clients to get them to the point where we can even do the positivity exercise. Because if a person is already listening, if a person has their already listening going full bore, it's going to be difficult to get through to them. Let me just check my hold on a second. Okay. Yeah, my sound device just took a little hiccup. I wanted to make sure we're okay. Now, emotional modulation. I called in the 7 fitness areas, I call the emotional area the gateway to the right side being those things we want: health, wealth, love, and happiness. I have relationships, professional, financial, but it's essentially those things we want. It's the things that marketers and advertisers go after us to let's buy more of this thing. And I call it the gateway because it's so easy to lose what you've done by getting triggered. So this here is that potential for hijacking. Most people have been hijacked. We've certainly seen people get hijacked. We've seen it happen in YouTube videos. I think without going too deep down that rabbit hole, I think a lot of the situations where you see police officers acting aggressively with citizens, I think it's happening both ways. I think the citizen is getting triggered, and I think that's triggering the police officer, and then they have this just escalates, and neither one of them can come back down. And like the police officer saying, "Stop resisting," and the person saying, "I'm not resisting," but they're in fight or flight, freeze or faint. They don't realize that they're tense, they're locked up, and their adrenaline is pumping. And I think both sides need training to understand what's going on. And so de-escalation is not a mental exercise. De-escalation is a physiological exercise, because your neurons are off and running. And I like to look at the network of neurons like a mob, and they're off and running, and then they're telling other people, and there's more people coming, and the mob is getting bigger and bigger, and it's out of control. And you can actually see that happening. So we don't want this hijacking to occur. And that's where we're going next, with the emotional part. So in the emotional, we have, and I call it modulation versus regulation. So regulation would be like a thermostat. You can adjust it up and down. You can just make it whatever you want to make it. But modulation is specifically adjusting your emotions in such a way that you're going to be optimized for whatever the situation you're in. In her book, Dr. Joan Rosenberg, the name of the book is 90 Seconds to a Life You'll Love. And she says that these 8 negative emotions, everything can be distilled into one of these 8. So you take all the possible negative emotions, and these 8 labels actually address them. And the reason she does that is important. So there's a challenge. If you take this conversation away and you just look at feeling bad, and then we call that anxiety. So many things could be anxiety. As a matter of fact, excitement and anxiety have a very similar signature. And this is why a lot of times when people are about to achieve something that they want, the anxiety kicks in because it's triggered. Back to the network of neurons. So now you have excitement, it actually triggered anxiety. So labeling it is very, very important. So she has these 8: sadness, shame, helplessness, anger, embarrassment, disappointment, frustration, and vulnerability. And the picture of the surfer, the point is the emotions were never meant to be harbored or dwelled upon or suppressed. In fact, suppressing emotions, you see I have surf, don't suppress. Surfing is allowing the emotion to flow through. Suppressing it, you're actually you're making it worse. Because the more energy you put into it, the worse it becomes. And so the other reason why suppressing is bad is because if you suppress the negative emotions, you're also robbing yourself of the experience of the joyful emotions. So it goes both ways. So surf, don't suppress. And then we have the emotional modulation, as I mentioned, 90 seconds, and you just let it pass through. You surf that wave, you feel it go through you. And so I have LLL, locate the emotion. First thing you do is locate it. Then you label it with one of these 8, and then you learn from it. So you locate the emotion, you label the emotion, and you learn from the emotion. And the reason I say learn from it, so back in the hunter-gatherer time, imagine being in a tribe and there's no language. And there's not a lot of information, and people are trying to eat different things. The face, by the way, is the only part of the human body where the skin is connected directly to the muscle. There's 700 involuntary muscles in the face. They show emotion immediately. The neuroscientists tell me that the reason why emotions are what they are is because if you imagine in a hunter-gatherer, a person bites into a piece of fruit or some kind of a plant or vegetable, instantly everyone in the tribe would know just by looking at their face if this was good or bad. If a person in the tribe sees something off in the bushes and they hear a sound, instantly they can see this person's face. Is it a tiger, or is it just a branch that fell? Immediately they could read that person's face without everybody turning around. They just look at that face and they know instantly. And this is why the emotions we talk about, it passes through in 90 seconds. You don't want to hang on to them. Then you want to acknowledge. So in the locate, you're also acknowledging it. You're acknowledging the emotion is here and recognizing that you've got that emotion and that it's okay. So you're not suppressing it, you're acknowledging it. Then here we have reducing the emotion by labeling it. So it is no longer this big anxiety ball, it's just a frustration. It's a specific frustration. So you're reducing it and you're defining it. And then you learn from it. What is this emotion there to tell me? What am I supposed to learn from this emotion? Oh, well, don't make trades outside of your parameters. Don't break your rules when you're trading, whatever that would be. And then while you're learning from it, it's surfing that wave. You literally, when you do this, you literally feel the rush of the emotion come up and then it subsides. What happens is that too often we suppress the emotion, and when we suppress it, what happens is it gets larger, it gets bigger, and by it getting bigger, it's like more neurons come online, and next thing you know, we're out of control, we're being triggered. And so what I'm talking about, if you go back a few slides, this is what we're talking about. So we've done everything we needed to do. We've done the priming, we've taken care of the cognitive biases, we've got the positivity thing here. So we're readjusting on the reaction. We've got a pause, so we're assessing and then deciding and making a choice. But still, it still hijacks us. Every once in a while, something will be so surprising, so difficult that it still triggers us. And that's what we're talking about here. So when that happens, if you were to suppress it, let's say you have this is the event, and it's causing this emotion, this negative emotion. And this is you over here trying to suppress it. So you're passing on information, you're saying it's not that bad. Well, the more you attempt to suppress it, let's keep in mind the reason why this emotion exists, the reason why you have all this intensity around it is because there was some threat. And by having, you're emotional about it because it's not really emotional, it's your fight or flight. The reason why you're in fight or flight is because you want to survive. And I should say your subconscious wants you to survive. And you're saying it's not that big a deal. Don't worry about it. Well, now, because you are adding to the wrong side, you're on the wrong side of this thing. You're on the side of the event saying, chill out. So it grows because it's about survival. This is now survival. And so then you add some more positivity and some positive mental attitude and some reframing and trying to suppress this thing down. And you're not hearing me. No, there's a Serengeti tiger and we're going to die. It gets bigger. So then you start getting more intense. You bring more intensity to it. Well, guess what? The threat just got bigger. If the threat gets bigger, the brain is going to survive. So it gets bigger. It's going to start, in my way of saying it, leaching from other areas of the body to take what it needs to eradicate this threat. And that's what's going on. This is why you don't want to suppress it. Most people have experienced it, or we've seen somebody, the more they try to suppress it, the worse it gets. It's literally like you're fighting against yourself. But because you're fighting against yourself, it's your mind fighting against your subconscious. And because you're treating the subconscious as a mind, you don't realize that it's just associations, and they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You have to actually get away from it at that point. It's kind of late here. We need to just chill out, take a walk, go to sleep, whatever you can do to get back to stasis. And then So if I run into this situation with the client, we just move on to another subject, completely different topic. We deal with something that's going to get their mind off of things and go that route. All right. So that's where we are. The emotional reset, 90 seconds, let it run through, locate it, label it, learn from it, and acknowledge that it's there. Don't try to suppress it. Reduce and define it to something that you can actually deal with, and now you can address it and then surf the crest as you learn from it. And that's the left side. That's the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. I don't talk about the right side in this workshop because this is about gaining agency. And now that you have the agency, it's what's next. All right. So now this is like we're going along the upper and the lower limit. Everything's going fine. We get too high, and we think about it in sales. If you're selling, you get up here to the upper areas and you start thinking things are going to go wrong. And sure enough, they do. And then you start coming down here and you don't like where you're heading. So you work harder and you bring it back up. And then you get up here and you think things are going to go wrong. So we're living this life over and over and over. And while we have coherence in here, it's not our best life. And the thing that's keeping us from getting into this area is we got stories and priming and habit patterns. We've got violence and good experiences. I put good experiences in there because with the thinking about the I don't want power, you can have something that worked so well in your past that you choose to do it over and over and over, and you won't let it go. And we've seen this happen. Habit patterns, things our teachers said, our parents, discrimination, all sorts of things are up in this area, this barrier. And Joe Dispenza talks about it as crossing the river. You get up here a little bit, you get knocked back down. You get up in there a little bit, you get knocked back down. And we end up staying back in this zone. And this is the 95% of everything we do is done by habit. The reason this is hard to cross is because it's not a mental exercise, it's a physiological exercise, and you have conditioning that you have to work through. You're literally neutralizing conditioning along the way. This is neuroplasticity. This is where the neuroplasticity is happening because you're changing your brain. And when you change your brain, remember, you're not changing the neurons, you're allowing the synapse to self-eliminate in favor of a synapse for a new neural pathway. And that process is called synaptogenesis, and it takes time. That's where neuroplasticity is occurring. And when you start to experience this as cognitive dissonance instead of anxiety, remember, excitement and anxiety have the similar signature, and you're going to be anxious up here. You're going to be excited up here. And you could think that this is telling you that you're back down here, but you've got to learn to recognize that it's cognitive dissonance and that it's nothing that you should be afraid of. It's nothing you should be worrying about. And you get through here, but it's not a quick, easy, I show in a couple of slides later, it's a process because you're basically raising the lows. You're having higher lows, but you're still not across that upper barrier, but you're raising your lows, your higher lows. Your lows are getting higher, and you're working through this, and you get knocked back down. The point is you got to keep getting back on the horse. There's a lot of books written about operating up here because after people make it, they talk about what's happened, but they don't really talk about what happened here. They may talk about this beginning, but they forget the inner work that's been happening. I told you I had to close my motorcycle business. It was my life savings. Everything was in it because there was a tourism business, renting motorcycles to people from around the world. The pandemic shut down all travel. There's no more motorcycle business. I lost everything. And while I can talk about what I did when I was really in it, and this goes way back to the first realizing it was going to have to happen, is getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning, not being able to go back to sleep, going out walking, just trying to get away from just whatever, right? It's just, everything was just stressful. And so there's a lot written about operating up here, but not a lot here. And what I'm telling you is this is where we've got to spend some time with people. This is why coaching, you give insights, and those insights help people get across this barrier. But it's more than just insights, because you actually have to rewrite some of the conditioning. And once you're above the line, now you're in that field of possibility. We've got the opportunities and we have threats, but remember, opportunities can seem like threats. Excitement and anxiety can be the same. And opportunities, anything different, the subconscious treats anything different as a threat. And that's one of the challenges with getting across this barrier, is that it's different, and anything different is seen as a threat. The unfamiliar and the unknown, back to this slide, the unfamiliar and the unknown are seen as threats. And that's where that cognitive dissonance comes from. Not only that, you're pushing against beliefs. You've believed all your life that you can't get across this barrier. Now all of a sudden you're across the barrier, you're getting all this weird cognitive dissonance. That's why a psychologist will tell you that once you make a big shift, you're probably not ready to knock the cover off the ball. You actually have to spend some time in there. I say that's this getting used to letting the neuroplasticity happen. And now we have this, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is greater than it's ever been. I mentioned earlier about the compound curve of Moore's law. So Moore's law started in 67, revised in 70, to say that every 18 months, technology capability doubles. And if you look at those examples of taking a penny and doubling it every day for 30 days, it turns into $10 million. Well, 90% of that $10 million was done in the last 5 days. And if you think about the last 40 years or so of us being in this, or 50 years being in this Moore's law of working with this technology expanding, we're on that very steep part of the curve. You've got artificial intelligence, you have programs writing programs, and on and on. And it's changing so rapidly. So our conditioning is nowhere near, our conditioning from 0 to 7 is nowhere near what it needs to be for this time. And that's why we have to have ways to shut out the VUCA noise, because it doesn't make sense to pay attention to it. It's just going to get us off our game. I talked about, as you're rising above here, it's not just this easy thing, it's the lows getting higher, right? And you may not see much progress on the top line until you've worked through all that stuff on the bottom. So the lows get higher, and then finally you break through. And now you go through the inflection point, and now you're operating in this area. And this is how I view the turning of the flywheel. And that's a takeoff from the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. He talks about turning this massively heavy flywheel. And the first time you turn it, the first day, it doesn't move very much, but you come back, every day, you just keep giving it some turns, and eventually it starts turning faster and faster. And I imagine that's this work on the flywheel. I have these vertical lines and horizontal lines. These are like your pivots. They're vertical, like little projects that are adjusting. And then you run the operational excellence to the point where you're starting to bump up against the limits. And then you run the project, you run a new project to get back to another plateau, and you run that. So that's sort of operational and pivoting illustrated. And here we have pulling it all together. So this is the be, do, have experience that's above the line. The paradigm helps keep people stuck in the 95%. I say one of those paradigms is that the subconscious is a mind. As long as you think the subconscious is a mind, you're constantly putting it back to that mind and giving it credibility. Once you see that it's not a mind and you realize it's a network of neurons, you treat it for what it is. And then also when you reflect on the fact that it's associations and all about the past, you get yourself to the point where you're only giving it a data point. And that's the point, back to this pause. We want to have that initial reaction from the subconscious as just a data point. And I mentioned projects and pivots, operational focus. And so there's the shifts. This is what we worked through today, the mental, conscious versus subconscious. And we talked about thinking fast and thinking slow, and that thinking fast is not really thinking, it's subconscious and associations. It's the network of neurons. We talked about the physical, rethinking, cognitive processing, and realizing that the majority of our cognitive processing in a normal basis is is physiological. Once you go through this work, obviously, you'll see that you're going to have a much more conscious, mental or mindful processing instead of physiological network of neurons. And then the spiritual interaction with the higher self. And this is where we can actually retrain the subconscious, and we retrain the subconscious so that the automaticity of the subconscious works for us. And then the final one is emotional, maintaining a growth mindset. And we're maintaining a growth mindset by using empowerment catalysts. There were some slides back earlier where I talked about the resistance factors and the empowerment catalyst, but that's all after the fact. We want to use the positivity reset in the spiritual area that I covered to not have to use this, but it's there when you need it. So if you ever do get knocked off the growth mindset into fixed mindset, you have a way out. So I'm going to do a full workshop on this on October 3rd at 7 a.m. So this is next week. You can find it on my LinkedIn profile, Morris Maduro on LinkedIn. In the feature, you'll see this workshop. You can register there, and we'll actually have the breakout sessions and more of the practice in Zoom room. So we'll have the live interaction and make sure that these skills are adopted. But that's it for now. Hopefully you can use these. Feel free to bounce back to me with any questions, and you can reach me best ways on LinkedIn, and we'll go from there. All right. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time. Cheers.